The soft hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and muted jazz created an illusion of serenity in the penthouse overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline. From the corner of the room, Ethan Walker observed the crowd with a practiced detachment. He had attended countless parties like this, events where wealth, influence, and perception were currency, and secrets were carefully tucked behind champagne flutes and designer gowns. Yet tonight felt different. Victoria, his wife, stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, laughing. At first glance, the scene was ordinary. A woman in a sleek, midnight blue dress, her hair cascading in loose waves, sharing a laugh with a man across from her. But something about the way she leaned into him, the brush of her hand against his arm, the tilt of her head as she whispered something that made him catch a flash of her smile, set off a sudden, visceral jolt in Ethan's chest. He felt the pang almost immediately, sharp and unwelcome. Betrayal was not new to him. He had always carried the wary awareness that desire could twist people in quiet, imperceptible ways. But witnessing it in this context, so casual, so seemingly innocent to the others around them, felt like a personal violation. He watched the man's hand hover for a moment, too long near her shoulder. The subtle brush of fingers as she responded with a laugh that was just slightly too intimate. The world seemed to narrow, the crowd blurred into a haze of color and sound, and all that remained was that small, private interaction that nobody else noticed or perhaps nobody else cared about. Ethan's mind raced. Was it a misreading? A moment of playful jest between acquaintances? He tried to rationalize, telling himself that he was overreacting, that his imagination was tainting reality. But every time Victoria's eyes met the men's, a flicker of something unspoken passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that cut deeper than any argument could. He felt his hands tighten around the glass he held, the weight of chilled champagne grounding him. Even as a wave of unease crept up his spine, the music shifted, a slow saxophone melody that seemed to echo the tension inside him. He scanned the room, noticing the laughter, the ease, the careful posturing of his peers. Everything was polished, controlled. Yet in this perfection, the fracture revealed itself. Victoria's laughter carried over the hum of the party, its warmth unmistakable. But now it felt alien. He remembered the quiet dinners, the stolen glances in dimly lit hallways, the subtle gestures that once made him feel secure, and now, here, under crystal chandeliers, and the approving gaze of Manhattan's elite, that sense of intimacy had been commandeered by someone else. He tried to pull himself together, taking a slow sip from his glass, focusing on the delicate aroma of the champagne. It should have calmed him. But instead, it amplified every doubt, every memory, every subtle unease he had long buried. He noticed the way the other guests moved around them unaware, indifferent, or perhaps complicit in a social dance that demanded appearances over authenticity. No one seemed to notice the play of hands, the quick, charged glances. Only he saw it. Only he felt it. Ethan shifted, the leather of his chair creaking under him, his eyes never leaving Victoria. His heartbeat picked up, an erratic drum that contrasted with the muted elegance around him. He thought of all the signs he had ignored, the late nights at work events, the whispered phone calls behind closed doors, the occasional evasions that he had passed off as stress or social necessity, and now, like a sudden, sharp incision, the reality of the distance between them revealed itself, raw and undeniable. A small laugh escaped Victoria again, a sound he had once cherished, now tasting bitter in his mind. The man she leaned toward, tall, charismatic, confident, seemed completely at ease, like he was in possession of something Ethan had never fully recognized in himself. Unchecked charm, freedom without consequence. The intimacy was subtle, almost playful, yet it carried the weight of a declaration Ethan could not ignore. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. He studied the curve of her smile, the tilt of her neck, the glimmer in her eyes. Each detail became a dagger, The faint brush of her fingers against his arm lingered in his mind like a ghost. He imagined the conversation they must be having, the private jokes, the fleeting touches. He could almost hear the whispered words over the ambient jazz, the soft cadence that no one else could decipher. And then, as if sensing his scrutiny, Victoria's gaze flicked in his direction. She smiled, warm, practiced, harmless. But Ethan saw the subtle hesitation behind it, a flicker of recognition that he had intruded upon a moment meant to be unseen. He felt the sting of vulnerability, anger, and despair collide. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to demand an explanation, to reclaim what he feared losing. Yet another part of him, the part honed by years of composure and self-control, urged patience, observation, careful consideration. He exhaled slowly, letting the air leave his lungs in a controlled rhythm. He could feel the tension coiling in his chest, a living thing. But he refused to act impulsively. For now, he would watch, catalog, and remember. The party continued around him, oblivious. A tableau of glittering faces and polite conversation. Only he bore witness to the fracture, the subtle betrayal that had taken root in the glittering heart of the room. Ethan's mind settled into a quiet resolve. Observation first, understanding second, action. When the time was right, he would not allow the moment to dictate him. Yet he knew the seed of upheaval had been planted, and once it grew, nothing would ever feel the same. In the soft, golden light of the penthouse, surrounded by the facades of charm and elegance, Ethan Walker realized something that would haunt him. For nights to come, some betrayals are not loud. Some betrayals whisper, and sometimes, witnessing them is the beginning of the end. Ethan Walker had built his life carefully, like the blueprint of a skyscraper. Every detail: career, social circle, even the appearance of domestic contentment was meticulously aligned. At 34, he was a respected marketing strategist in Manhattan, known for his analytical mind, composed demeanor, and uncanny ability to read people. He moved through life with a quiet confidence, the kind that commanded respect without needing to shout. But beneath the polished exterior of success lay a man who valued stability, loyalty, and subtle, unspoken truths more than applause. Victoria Walker, née Harper, seemed to embody the opposite spectrum. Charismatic, radiant, and unrestrained. She had quickly risen to prominence as a fashion influencer, whose online persona shimmered with glamour and desirability. Her social media feed painted a world of perfectly curated moments: champagne toasts on rooftop terraces, designer gowns at gala events, and smiles that seemed effortless yet practiced. Victoria thrived in the spotlight. Her charm, a currency she wielded with precision, yet beneath the curated perfection was a quietly restless yearning, a desire for admiration, attention, and the intoxicating validation of those who looked upon her with envy and longing. They had met at an industry gala years ago, a collision of intellect and magnetism. Ethan had been intrigued by her boldness, Victoria by his steady, inflappable présence. In the beginning, their differences were a source of fascination rather than friction. He admired the way she commanded attention without apology. She admired his quiet confidence, the patience with which he observed the world before moving within it. Their courtship was swift, public, and lauded. Friends whispered about their power couple potential, and social media celebrated every display of affection, every glamorous event attended together. Yet, behind the public smiles, the cracks had begun to appear early, almost imperceptibly. Victoria's energy demanded constant stimulation. Late-night parties, exotic trips, endless photo shoots, and collaborations. Ethan, grounded in his routine, found fulfillment in small certainties: shared dinners, Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, and the comforting rhythm of their apartment overlooking the city. Her appetite for novelty and social adoration, though alluring, increasingly conflicted with his desire for depth, consistency, and honesty. Ethan had noticed the subtle shifts first in her eyes, The fleeting glances at strangers who complimented her, the lingering laughter that seemed directed at someone other than him, the excitement that she carried home from events he could not attend. Victoria, in turn, had started to interpret his restraint as predictability, even dullness. She loved him, certainly, but she loved the idea of being adored by many, the thrill of being desired beyond the confines of their marriage. The tension between her craving for attention and his need for trust became a quiet, unspoken battle. A tug-of-war waged not with words, but through gestures, silences, and glances. Social pressures compounded their differences. In the world they inhabited, where image and perception were often valued above authenticity, their private dissonance carried a public weight. Friends and colleagues admired the unity they displayed, the effortless charm with which they navigated parties, red carpets, and corporate dinners. No one suspected the subtle fractures beneath the surface. Victoria maintained her online persona of happiness and allure, while Ethan continued to excel in his career and social engagements, all the while sensing the growing distance in their connection. Despite the tension, their love was real, layered, and complex, colored by shared history, tenderness, and the unspoken understanding that each had given the other more than just companionship. Ethan's loyalty remained steadfast, a quiet constant in a world of glitter and fleeting attention. He forgave minor indiscretions and brushed aside hints of flirtation, believing in the strength of their bond. Victoria, though restless and impulsive, never intended overt betrayal. At least, not at first. Her desire for validation was not born of malice, but of an insatiable hunger to feel seen, admired, and alive. Yet, the seeds of conflict had been sown. The convergence of Ethan's loyalty and Victoria's craving for recognition was an unstable equilibrium, and as life pressed forward, demands from work, obligations to friends, societal expectations, and the ceaseless gaze of public opinion, the tension grew. Each social gathering, each party, each fleeting moment of attention Victoria received from others acted like a spark, igniting unspoken fears and insecurities in Ethan. And with every glance she shared with strangers, every laugh that lingered just slightly too long, the possibility of betrayal loomed closer. Their marriage, once celebrated for its charm and apparent perfection, was quietly balancing on a knife edge. Ethan, attuned to subtleties, he could sense the currents of dissatisfaction and desire weaving through their interactions. Victoria, vibrant and unpredictable, navigated the same waters with a mixture of exhilaration and guilt, unaware of how her impulses, no matter how innocent they seemed to her, might fracture the life they had built together. It was in this context of elegance, ambition, and muted tension that the night of the party began, a night where the invisible threads connecting them would be tested, exposed, and ultimately severed. Ethan's mind, ever observant, cataloged every smile, every gesture, every nuance of movement as they entered the room. He was prepared to enjoy the evening, to mingle and maintain appearances, but beneath his calm exterior, a quiet vigilance had taken root. The cracks in their marriage, subtle yet undeniable, now shimmered under the golden light of chandeliers and the scrutinizing eyes of Manhattan's elite. For Ethan Walker, this night would not merely be a social engagement, it would be a lens, magnifying everything he had ignored, rationalized, or hoped would pass unnoticed. The patterns were there, the longing, the small betrayals, the divergences of desire, and tonight he would see them unfold before his eyes, illuminating the fragile, perilous nature of love, trust, and the intoxicating allure of attention. The days following the party were suffused with a quiet tension that Ethan could not ignore. Manhattan pulsed with its usual rhythm, yellow cabs rattling over steel bridges, the distant wail of sirens, the constant hum of ambition and ambition's shadows. But inside the Walker apartment, a different kind of noise prevailed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, the delayed responses to texts, The hurried goodnights whispered over the phone. The faint scent of someone else's perfume lingering briefly on Victoria's scarf. Ethan noticed these details with an almost painful clarity. He had always been observant, a trait that had served him well professionally and personally, but now it became a burden. Late nights at fashion industry events, which Victoria insisted were obligatory for her career, began to gnaw at him. Her explanations were plausible: networking, photo shoots, brand collaborations, but the consistency of the absences, the enthusiasm with which she shared her stories of flirty compliments or playful exchanges, started to erode the foundation of trust he had carefully constructed. At first, he attempted rationalization. Perhaps he was reading too much into harmless interactions. After all, Victoria had always been charming, and attention from others was inevitable in her line of work. Yet the unease persisted, a subtle but persistent echo in the corners of his mind. He caught himself checking her phone when she stepped away. A moment of weakness that left him feeling both guilty and justified. Messages from unfamiliar names. Brief exchanges that vanished the instant he entered the room, and emojis that seemed too intimate. All of them built a mosaic of suspicion he could not easily dismiss. Social gatherings, once a source of pleasure, became arenas of scrutiny. Ethan watched Victoria interact with others. A lingering touch here, a flirtatious laugh there. The way she leaned slightly closer to someone who was not him. Each movement was catalogued, dissected, and filed in the mental ledger of a husband growing increasingly anxious. Friends and colleagues, oblivious to the undercurrents, commented on her radiance, her charm, her effortless magnetism, inadvertently amplifying Ethan's insecurities. Have felt a creeping jealous, not just of the man who might be crossing boundaries, but of the adoration, attention, and validation she seemed to crave in ways he could not provide. Ethan wrestled with a swirl of emotions: doubt, anxiety, guilt, and anger. He questioned himself constantly. Had he missed the signs earlier? Was he overreacting? Imagining betrayals that were never real. But the evidence, however subtle, accumulated. The secretive texts, the whispered phone calls, the way she sometimes seemed distracted even when physically present, they painted a picture he could not easily erase. Each instance deepened his internal struggle, creating a tension that hovered between restraint and the urge to confront, between patience and the need to act. He noticed other small behaviors that unsettled him. Victoria would sometimes step away from him during events, offering vague excuses about needing a moment or taking a call. She laughed a little too easily at someone's joke, touched someone's arm in passing, with a casual grace that seemed rehearsed yet intimate. The playful familiarity, the brief sparks of attention, became unbearable in their repetition. Ethan felt a strange mix of admiration and resentment, a recognition of her charm, tinged with the fear that it was no longer reserved for him. At home, the apartment felt emptier. Victoria would return late, animated from some social engagement, leaving Ethan to wander the space between them. He tried to maintain his routine: exercise, reading, work calls, but each tick of the clock reminded him of her absence. Hair distance. Conversations grew shorter, less intimate. The comfortable rhythm of their marriage began to falter. He noticed the subtle hesitations in her speech, the way she avoided eye contact when she thought he wasn't watching, the tiny gestures of distraction that betrayed her divided attention. Ethan's internal dialogue became a battlefield. Rationality contended with suspicion, loyalty clashed with fear, and desire struggled against the looming specter of betrayal. He questioned his own perceptions. Was he imagining danger where there was none? Was he too sensitive, too possessive, too aware? And yet, every encounter, every small flirtation, every unexplained late night reinforced his growing certainty. Something was shifting between them, something he could not fully understand or control. Despite the turmoil, Ethan restrained himself. He did not confront Victoria impulsively. Instead, he observed, noted, and waited, cataloging every nuance of behavior that hinted at emotional distance. He forced himself to maintain appearances in public, to smile, to engage in polite conversation, to attend events as if nothing were amiss. But in private, the tension simmered, a slow burning ache that he could neither ignore nor resolve. He remembered the early days of their marriage, when moments of connection were effortless late-night walks through Central Park, quiet breakfasts in their apartment, shared laughter over minor mishaps. The contrast between that intimacy and the current, precarious distance made each subtle infraction feel magnified. Each flirtatious glance or playful touch, like a crack in the glass he had thought unbreakable. It was during one of these nights, alone in their apartment, with the city lights casting long shadows across the floor, that Ethan realized the full scope of his anxiety. The signs were not overt. There were no declarations, no confrontations, no obvious betrayals. Yet the emotional distance, the shifting desires, the subtle flirtations, all were undeniable. The question loomed if the pattern continued. If her craving for attention and his loyalty could not find equilibrium, what would become of their marriage? Ethan did not yet have an answer. What he did have was awareness, an acute and sometimes unbearable consciousness of the fragility of the bond he cherished. Every late night, every secretive message, every flirtatious smile at a gathering was a reminder that trust, once eroded, could never be fully restored. And in the quiet of their penthouse, with Manhattan glittering below, he felt the first true weight of impending betrayal pressing against his chest, a pressure that would only grow, leading them both to confront choices and truths they had long avoided. Ethan had learned to live with unease. He had cataloged gestures, noticed glances, and measured silences. But he had always clung to the hope that his observations were exaggerations of his imagination. That hope shattered in the quiet of a Thursday night. He was sitting in their minimalist Manhattan apartment, the city lights painting gold and silver patterns across the hardwood floors. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren outside were the only sounds. Victoria had gone out to meet a client, she had said, and the house was empty, except for the hum of the city beneath them. Ethan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a notification from an account he didn't recognize. Curiosity nudged him forward. He had promised himself he would never invade her privacy. But tonight, a quiet insistence, a mixture of fear and necessity, drove him to unlock her tablet that she had left behind. The screen lit up, and there it was, a message thread, glowing against the dim light. Casual at first, but increasingly intimate, warm, and unnervingly familiar. The words, the timing, the tone all pointed to an emotional closeness that bypassed him completely. Ethan's eyes moved across the text, his pulse quickening. This was not a fleeting flirtation. This was connection, frequent, deliberate, and unabashed. Memories of shared intimacy assaulted him. Quiet mornings with coffee steaming between them, the whispered jokes in bed, the late-night conversations where they had bared themselves without hesitation. He could feel the softness of her hand in his, the warmth of her body leaning against him in the darkness. And now, in these messages, he saw that same tenderness, the same flirtatious teasing, directed elsewhere. It was a cruel mirror, reflecting a reality he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled. Words of longing, shared laughter, a playful banter, all of it a violation of the trust he had assumed was unassailable. Ethan felt a surge of disbelief. How could this be happening? How could someone he had known so intimately, someone with whom he had shared years of quiet loyalty, divert such attention, such affection? Elsewhere, the betrayal was not a momentary lapse. It was a continuous, emotional tether connecting Victoria to another man, and every keystroke a reminder of his growing irrelevance. Anger surged next, sharp and undeniable. He could feel it radiate from his chest, coiling in his stomach like a living thing. Memories that had once brought comfort now cut like shards of glass. Every kiss, every gentle word, every shared moment of vulnerability. Had they meant anything to her? Was he merely a placeholder? A stabilizing presence while she sought excitement elsewhere? The realization burned, leaving him raw, exposed, and unsettled. Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to steady the tempest within him. Rational thought fought with emotional turmoil. He knew the danger of acting impulsively. Confrontation without clarity could destroy what remained of their bond, perhaps even more than the betrayal itself. Yet the knowledge, once obtained, could not be unlearned. It lodged in his mind like a splinter, a persistent ache that demanded reckoning. He replayed moments in his mind, the laughter at that rooftop party, the tilt of her head as she whispered to another man, the way she brushed against someone who was not him. Each recollection, once ambiguous, now carried unmistakable weight. Every playful gesture he had observed was confirmed as meaningful, the part of a larger pattern he had only glimpsed but never fully understood. Sleep eluded him. Ethan wandered the apartment, moving from room to room, as if the movement could stave off the storm inside. He considered calling her, confronting her immediately, but hesitation, tempered by the need for composure, restrained him. He had to understand first, had to map the scope of the connection before engaging, yet every passing minute magnified the pain, the sense of intrusion and inadequacy in the quiet. He reflected on the subtle signs he had ignored, the lateness of her returns, the distracted glances at her phone, the laughter that had lingered a fraction too long at gatherings. They had seemed insignificant, easily explainable until now. Ethan realized that the truth had been visible all along, but he had chosen to see what he wanted: loyalty, commitment, the illusion of mutual devotion. The revelation now demanded acknowledgement. He could not stop thinking about the other man. Tall, confident, seemingly effortless in charm, he existed in Ethan's mind not merely as a rival, but as a representation of the distance Victoria had been cultivating. It was not just physical or emotional attraction, it was the way she allowed herself to exist outside the bond they had created, to give pieces of her attention, intimacy, and desire elsewhere. The apartment, with its sleek lines and polished surfaces, suddenly felt like a cage. The memories, the revelations, the fragments of perceived happiness all collided, leaving Ethan oscillating between despair and anger. He understood, with painful clarity, that nothing would be the same. The knowledge of the emotional connection had altered the equilibrium of their marriage irreversibly. And yet, within the turmoil, a certain clarity emerged. Ethan realized that his response could define the next chapter of his life. He could choose to confront, to lash out, or to retreat and recalibrate, but the awareness itself granted him agency. The betrayal was undeniable, but so too was his capacity for measured response, for understanding, for reclaiming control over the narrative of his own life. Ethan sank into the armchair near the window, the city sprawling below, glittering like fractured stars. His mind lingered on the words, the tone, the intimacy in the messages, each phrase a reminder of what had shifted, each timestamp a marker of nights he had unknowingly shared her attention with another. And as he sat in the quiet, he understood that the path forward, whether confrontation, withdrawal, or a recalibration of boundaries, would demand courage, precision, and emotional clarity. Tonight, the world outside remained indifferent. The lights of Manhattan shimmered, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls of the Walker apartment. But inside, Ethan Walker felt the first irreversible rupture of trust, the first sharp recognition that love and loyalty, however steadfast, could be tested by the quiet, relentless pull of desire elsewhere. The turning point had arrived, and nothing would remain unchanged. The rooftop was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Manhattan stretched out below, a glittering tapestry of light and ambition. Indifferent to the private catastrophes unfolding above it, Ethan had arrived early, ostensibly to enjoy the event, but his mind had been elsewhere for weeks. Every step he took, every conversation he pretended to participate in, was filtered through a lens of suspicion, dread, and anticipation. Tonight, he had resolved to observe, not act, not accuse, just see the truth with his own eyes. Victoria was already there, Surrounded by the familiar hum of the city's elite, she looked radiant. Her black dress clinging in elegant folds, her hair catching the soft glow of the rooftop lighting. She moved with effortless grace, a queen among courtiers, and Ethan felt the familiar pang, the one that always preceded a storm. His pulse quickened, and he deliberately kept his distance, pretending to mingle, while his gaze followed her every move. Then he saw him, the other man, tall, impeccably dressed, with an easy smile that seemed rehearsed for charm alone. He approached Victoria, their familiarity immediate and fluid, as though the world around them existed solely to facilitate this private connection. Ethan's stomach tightened, a coil of tension that refused to unwind. He stepped closer under the pretense of greeting someone else, and the sight that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. They were laughing soft, intimate laughter that seemed too private for the open air. Victoria brushed her hand against his arm, not in the casual manner of the room's social dance, but with the deliberate warmth of familiarity. Her head tilted slightly toward him, hair falling in a way that seemed choreographed for intimacy. He leaned in to whisper something, and she laughed. A sound that had once belonged solely to Ethan, now given freely to another. Ethan felt the world shrink around him. Music, chatter, wind, city lights all blurred into insignificance. Only the tableau of their interaction remained, vivid, undeniable. The playful touch escalated, subtle at first, a hand resting briefly against a forearm, a light pressure of fingers grazing the wrist, but each gesture crossed invisible boundaries, those lines of intimacy that Ethan had long assumed were sacred. Time slowed. Ethan watched as she leaned closer, her smile softening in a way that spoke of trust, of affection, of something more than friendship. The other man's hand hovered, tentative, then settled briefly on her back, a touch that lingered longer than politeness allowed. The intimacy, restrained yet unmistakable, struck Ethan like a hammer. Every memory of their shared life surged in him simultaneously. The quiet mornings, the whispered confessions, the nights spent tracing lines of vulnerability across skin, all collided with this moment of undeniable betrayal. The realization hit him in full force. The emotional connection he had glimpsed in messages had manifested here, in physical space, in a way that was unavoidable and painfully intimate. Ethan's heart pounded not with rage initially, but with disbelief. He wanted to speak, to call her out, to demand an explanation, but his body remained frozen. The sheer audacity of their disregard for his presence rendered him invisible, yet painfully aware. The world seemed to hold its breath alongside him, the city lights flickering like distant witnesses to a private devastation. He noticed the subtle nuances, the way her fingers lingered on his arm, the tilt of her chin toward him, the small, playful smile that had once belonged to their shared world, now repurposed for another. Ethan felt a mix of fury and grief. He could not articulate. Rage flared, tempered by shock. The urge to confront collided with the need to understand the full scope of the betrayal. The other man leaned closer, their conversation dropping into tones and inflections that carried a closeness Ethan had never been part of. Victoria's eyes softened in response, a mirror of warmth he had only ever seen reserved for him. And yet, she laughed, tilted her head, and allowed the intimacy to deepen, a playful, lingering touch that made Ethan's chest tighten unbearably. In that moment, Ethan recognized the finality of the fracture. The betrayal was no longer theoretical, no longer hidden behind plausible deniability or subtle signs. It was here, raw and undeniable, crystallized in gestures, glances, and touches. The trust he had placed in Victoria, the loyalty he had offered without reservation, now lay shattered, strewn across the rooftop in the quiet, almost casual intimacy of a connection that was never meant to include him. He stepped back, finally allowing himself to move, his mind racing through the aftermath before it had even begun. The crowd, oblivious, continued its elegant dance around him, champagne and laughter flowing freely. While he stood frozen in a private storm, every instinct told him to act, to confront. to demand explanation. Yet a strange calm settled over him, a recognition that this moment, observed fully, had irrevocably shifted the balance of power. Ethan realized something crucial. Witnessing the betrayal in its full clarity granted him insight and agency. The emotional wound was deep, undeniable. Yet it was also precise. He could choose the timing of his confrontation, the terms of his response, or the path of retreat. The knowledge was his shield and his burden. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the sharp clarity of focus amidst the ache of heartbreak. Victoria and the other man continued, oblivious to his gaze, their laughter blending with the city sounds in a way that felt almost cruel. Every movement, every gesture, every fleeting smile was a confirmation of what he had feared, a stark and painful revelation. And as Ethan turned away from the rooftop edge, letting the wind whip through his hair, he understood the magnitude of the moment. This was no longer about suspicion or doubt. It was real. It was present. And it demanded a reckoning that would reshape every aspect of their shared life. Tonight, the glittering city beneath them witnessed not only the intimacy of betrayal, but also the quiet resolve of a man who had seen the fracture. Ethan Walker had observed the line crossed, the invisible boundary violated, and in that knowledge, he found a seat of clarity amidst devastation. The climax had arrived, raw and unavoidable, leaving him to navigate the fallout that would follow. The apartment felt unbearably empty. Ethan moved through the rooms as though navigating a space that no longer belonged to him. Though the furniture, the decor, and even the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows remained unchanged. Every familiar object now carried a subtle taint, a reminder of intimacy he had once shared with Victoria. But that had been irrevocably altered. The betrayal lingered in the air, invisible yet suffocating. He withdrew into solitude with a deliberate rigor. Work became a refuge, a place where metrics and schedules demanded attention and left little room for emotional spiraling. Yet even there, his mind drifted relentlessly back to the rooftop, to the stolen gestures, the whispered laughter, the undeniable warmth she had extended to another. Trust, once foundational, felt fragile and provisional. A bridge that could no longer bear the weight of certainty. Victoria tried to break through the barrier he had erected. Her messages were frequent at first, apologies, explanations, rationalizations carefully worded to minimize blame. "It's not what you think," she wrote once, in a text that had previously carried comfort, but now stung like salt in an open wound. She called, her voice soft, almost pleading. But each attempt to bridge the growing distance between them was met with calm detachment. Ethan listened, considered, but did not respond in kind. He knew that words alone could not repair the fracture. Actions were required, and the actions had already occurred. The subtle dynamics of their social life began to shift. Friends noticed a certain tension when the Walkers appeared together. Victoria's laughter no longer reached Ethan's ears with ease, her smiles more performative, and his responses measured, clipped, distant. Invitations to events were declined with polite excuses. And when they did attend, they moved like two halves of a whole that no longer aligned. Observers whispered, noting the change in energy, the careful avoidance of touch, the absence of shared glances that had once defined them as a couple. The facade of perfection began to fracture quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet irreversibly. Ethan's nights were restless. He wandered the apartment, sometimes stopping by the windows to gaze at the glittering city below, imagining lives untouched by betrayal, imagining choices that could have led elsewhere. He questioned everything, his judgment, and trusting his capacity to forgive. The authenticity of the intimacy they had shared. Each memory became a double-edged sword, a reminder of both love and deception. Victoria, sensing his distance, tried to rationalize. She spoke of social pressures, career demands, fleeting moments of weakness, and the allure of attention her words intended to explain, to contextualize, even to manipulate. But Ethan had learned the lesson of observation. He had witnessed the boundaries crossed. Rationalization could no longer alter the truth he had seen. The intimacy he had once assumed exclusive was now permanently shared elsewhere, and no explanation could restore that singularity. Silence became their dominant language. Conversations were measured, strategic, stripped of warmth. Ethan maintained a careful civility, refusing to escalate, refusing to surrender to raw emotion in public or private. Victoria's attempts at closeness, her subtle gestures meant to coax him back. We were met with polite acknowledgement rather than engagement. The emotional distance she had cultivated through actions now mirrored his intentional withdrawal, a quiet stalemate of fractured trust. Even their friends and social circles became inadvertent witnesses to the aftermath. Casual observers noticed the tension, the slight stiffening of Ethan's posture when Victoria leaned too closely towards someone, the way Victoria's laughter seemed to falter when he entered a room, the careful choreography required to maintain appearances, behind the curated Instagram moments, behind the perfect smiles and stage glamour. The erosion of connection was palpable, yet few grasped the depth, the psychological weight of the fracture. Ethan wrestled privately with anger and grief. With the longing for explanation and the simultaneous desire to retreat, he questioned the nature of love, its boundaries, and the price of loyalty. Could love survive emotional infidelity? Could trust be rebuilt once it had been fundamentally compromised? These questions had no immediate answers, only the gnawing tension of uncertainty and the weight of observation. Victoria oscillated between regret and defiance. At times, she appeared genuinely remorseful, seeking validation through attempts at honesty. At other times, she seemed almost nonchalant, testing the boundaries of Ethan's restraint, probing for signs of vulnerability he no longer allowed her to access. Every interaction reinforced the chasm that had grown between them, a chasm that was both a defense mechanism for Ethan and a mirror of the emotional risk Victoria had taken. The world outside remained indifferent. Manhattan's lights continued to shimmer, the hum of traffic and distant laughter, a constant, unsympathetic backdrop. Yet inside the apartment, time slowed. Each moment stretched thin by the quiet erosion of intimacy. Ethan became hyper-aware of every gesture, every tone, every expression, cataloging them with precision, as though observation alone could preserve his understanding, his control, his clarity amidst the collapse. And then, in rare, quiet moments, Ethan allowed himself to reflect on the implications. The betrayal was real, but it also illuminated truths long overlooked: the fragility of appearances, the human hunger for validation, the quiet ways desire could circumvent loyalty. He recognized that the fallout, while painful, also offered insight, clarity, self-awareness, and the possibility of choosing his next steps deliberately rather than reactively. He realized that the marriage, as it had existed, was no longer sustainable in its previous form. The intimacy, the trust, the unquestioned bond, they had all been compromised. What remained was a cautious equilibrium, two people coexisting under the same roof, their emotional lives fractured, their public image maintained, but the private connection forever altered. Ethan's solitude became both a sanctuary and a crucible. Within its confines, he wrestled with grief, anger, and reflection. He acknowledged the pain of witnessing betrayal, the frustration of unreciprocated loyalty, and the complex mix of emotions that love and trust could generate. The process was slow, painful, and deliberate, a deep excavation of feelings that would lay the groundwork for whatever choices he would ultimately make. And so, the fallout persisted, not explosive, not public, but intimate and relentless. Within the walls of their apartment, the subtle collapse of facade mirrored the internal fractures of both individuals. Observers saw perfection. Ethan experienced a quiet, unyielding rupture, a fracture line along which the next phase of confrontation, reckoning, and potential resolution would inevitably follow. Ethan had spent days preparing for this moment, not in meticulous planning of words, but in quiet cultivation of composure. He wanted clarity, not spectacle, truth, not drama. The city pulsed below their chosen meeting, spot a discreet, Dimly lit penthouse lounge belonging to a friend who had agreed to host them privately. No one would overhear. No one would judge. Here, the conversation could be unfiltered, rough, and unavoidable. Victoria arrived, her elegance intact, but her demeanor tentative. Aware of the weight she carried, she wore a dress of muted gold, the kind that caught the soft light without demanding attention. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, a subtle surrender of vanity, perhaps, or a subconscious acknowledgement of the gravity of what awaited. Ethan greeted her with a nod, neutral and calm. He could feel the tension vibrating between them, taut, yet restrained, like a wire stretched to its limit. For a moment, they sat in silence. Words were unnecessary. The air itself carried the weight of past betrayals and unspoken grievances. Ethan studied her, not as a husband, not as a victim, but as a man seeking understanding. Her eyes, once so familiar, now contained a mixture of guilt, defensiveness, and the habitual charm she wielded so effortlessly. She opened her mouth, paused, and then finally spoke. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she began, voice soft, carefully measured. I never intended to hurt you. It was impulsive. I didn't realize how much it would affect you or us. Ethan listened. He let the words hang in the air, neither accepting nor rejecting them immediately. There was truth here, he recognized, but also the self-protective rationalization of someone trying to reclaim control over their narrative. Victoria's gaze dropped to her hands, twisting a ring absent-mindedly, betraying her nervousness. I know it's not just a mistake, he said quietly, his voice steady, controlled. I've seen it. I've read it. I've witnessed it. He allowed the pause to settle, the statement heavy with inevitability. Victoria's eyes lifted, brimming slightly with tears, and for the first time, the full measure of her remorse became visible. She started, hesitated, then continued. I wanted attention. I felt invisible sometimes. Ethan. And when someone noticed me, really noticed me, I gave into it. It wasn't about you. Not directly. I never wanted to lose what we had. But I wanted affirmation, validation, and I got carried away. Her confession, though sincere, was a double-edged revelation. Ethan felt a surge of empathy, human desire, and insecurity were universal, but also a renewed clarity. The betrayal was real, intentional in its emotional consequence, and he had the right to respond on his own terms. I understand desire. Victoria. I understand longing, Ethan replied. But understanding doesn't excuse boundary violations. Love isn't just about feelings, it's about respect. It's about the choices you make, even when impulses are strong. Her lips trembled slightly, and she nodded, swallowing hard. I know, and I'm sorry. I can't undo it. I can't take back the messages, the moments, the everything. But I want you to know that I regret it, truly. Ethan's gaze was steady, his composure deliberate. He felt the tremor of hurt in his chest, but he did not allow it to dictate his words. I appreciate your honesty, but regret alone doesn't restore trust. You can't reclaim what's been shared elsewhere as if it never happened. You can only show through your actions whether the boundaries will be respected moving forward. Victoria's eyes filled fully with tears now, but Ethan remained calm, asserting his presence not through anger or accusation, but through moral authority and emotional clarity. He recognized that his restraint, his deliberate steadiness, was a form of power, one that demanded respect far more than confrontation or retaliation ever could. I need space, he continued, voice unwavering, not for punishment, not for spite, but to recalibrate to determine what loyalty, trust, and love mean for me moving forward. You've acted on impulses that cross lines I can no longer ignore. I will not negotiate the terms of my self-respect. She swallowed, nodding again, this time without argument. The weight of the room was palpable, heavy with truth, grief, and the silent recognition of consequences. Ethan did not rage. He did not beg. He did not plead. Instead, he maintained presence steady, unwavering, morally grounded. The clarity in his posture, in his voice, was a declaration more potent than any accusation. He would define the boundaries of his life and his emotions. For Victoria, the confrontation was a reckoning. She had exposed her vulnerability, confessed her impulses, and felt the full measure of accountability. For Ethan, it was a reclamation not of Victoria, not of the marriage as it had been, but of himself. His moral authority was intact, his emotional clarity unbroken. The bond they shared had been tested, and in this crucible, he emerged with awareness, self-possession, and resolve. They parted that evening not with the warmth of reconciliation, but with the quiet dignity of mutual acknowledgement. No dramatic gestures, no imploring embraces, just the sober understanding that choices had consequences, that desire and impulse could not override respect, and that the past could not be erased. Ethan left the meeting with a steady heartbeat, a mind alert and clear, carrying the knowledge that he had witnessed betrayal, yet retained his autonomy. Outside, Manhattan sprawled in all its luminous glory. The city would not pause, would not judge, would not witness the quiet recalibration of two lives forever altered. But within that penthouse, in the controlled stillness after confession and honesty, Ethan Walker understood something profound: betrayal, while deeply painful, he could not define him. He could honor the past, acknowledge the rupture, and assert boundaries that safeguarded both his dignity and his future. For the first time in weeks, he felt the subtle but undeniable shift of agency, returning an emotional recalibration that allowed clarity to emerge from chaos, and composure to replace despair. The confrontation had not healed the wounds, but it had illuminated the path forward, measured, deliberate, and resolutely his own. Ethan stood on the edge of the city's morning light, the early sun filtering through skyscrapers, casting long golden shadows across the streets of Manhattan. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of possibility, of lives being remade. For the first time in months, he breathed deeply, without the weight of doubt pressing on his chest. The confrontation with Victoria had passed. The emotional reckoning had settled into a clarity that was both painful and liberating. He had chosen his path deliberately, not in anger, not in revenge, but in the sober assertion of self-respect. He understood that liberation was not about erasing memory or ignoring betrayal. It was about reclaiming agency, making choices that honored his own dignity, and refusing to allow the missteps of another to dictate the terms of his life. The emotional chains that had bound him, expectations of loyalty, the pressure of appearances, the weight of imagined obligations were now loosened. He could walk forward unencumbered, guided by his own values rather than the whims of desire and deceit. Victoria remained behind, inhabiting the social circles they had once moved through together, but the vibrancy she had wielded with such ease now felt hollow. Her attempts at charm no longer commanded the same influence. The subtle fractures in relationships, once invisible, were now apparent to those who observed closely. She was forced to confront her choices, the impulses she had indulged, and the absence of the trust that had once sustained her. The admiration she had sought from others could not replace the bond she had damaged, nor could it soothe the isolation that grew quietly around her. Ethan's departure was not dramatic. There were no confrontations in the street, no public scenes of accusation. Instead, it was a measured withdrawal, a deliberate severing of ties without spectacle. He informed her, with calm composure, that he would be moving forward on his own, establishing boundaries that were absolute. In his mind, this was not punishment, but preservation, the preservation of self, the protection of dignity, and the careful cultivation of a life guided by clarity rather than chaos. He spent the following weeks in quiet reflection, walks through Central Park, long rides along the East River, and early mornings in cafes where he observed the rhythms of the city became rituals of recalibration. Each step, each solitary moment, reinforced the realization that freedom was not merely the absence of betrayal, but the conscious choice to live according to one's own principles. Ethan's interactions with friends and colleagues were no longer governed by appearances or obligation. They were chosen, intentional, and affirming. The past remained present. Of course, memories of shared breakfasts, whispered jokes, and the tactile warmth of intimacy lingered, but they no longer held the power to define him. Instead, they served as reminders of lessons learned that love could be complex, desire could be dangerous, and that personal boundaries were essential in navigating both. Ethan understood that self-respect was the foundation upon which all future connections would be built, and that the quiet assertion of boundaries was itself a form of strength. Victoria, left to confront the consequences of her choices, began to navigate a social landscape altered by her own actions. Invitations became fewer. Whispers of disapproval circulated subtly, and the people whose attention she had so carefully cultivated began to notice the cracks in the facade. The isolation was not immediate, nor catastrophic, but it was inescapable. A slow, deliberate mirror of the emotional distance she had created through her impulses. In these moments, she confronted the depth of her own restlessness, the repercussions of seeking affirmation outside of mutual trust, and the stark reality of living with fractured relationships. Ethan, meanwhile, began to explore dimensions of himself that had long been dormant. Time previously consumed by navigating uncertainty, doubt, and betrayal was now available for reflection, growth, and pursuit of interests unencumbered by manipulation or obligation. He revisited old passions, engaged with creative projects, and allowed himself the rare luxury of uninterrupted thought. In solitude, he discovered not emptiness, but potential and expansive space in which his choices were fully his own. The city continued its relentless pace, indifferent yet vibrant, carrying on as though no human heartbreak had ever occurred. Yet within this indifferent expanse, Ethan moved with a newfound lightness. His steps were deliberate but unburdened, his interactions purposeful but unforced. He had experienced betrayal, witnessed the fracture of trust, and faced the quiet devastation of emotional distance, and through it all, he had retained himself his principles, his clarity, and the capacity for measured response. On reflective evenings, as he stood at his apartment window, overlooking the skyline, Ethan acknowledged the paradoxical relief that betrayal had brought. It had stripped away illusions, clarified boundaries, and revealed truths about human desire, attachment, and resilience. The pain had been intense, intimate, and unavoidable, but it had also facilitated liberation. He realized that the deepest freedom did not lie in retaliation or vengeance, but in the conscious choice to move forward unencumbered, guided by self-respect and emotional sovereignty. The story of Ethan and Victoria closed not with spectacle or dramatic confrontation, but with reflection and quiet dignity. Ethan walked into a new life, liberated from emotional chains, societal expectations, and the manipulations of impulses outside his control. Victoria remained to face the isolation born of choices and indulgence. Confronted by the limits of charm and the consequences of divided attention, the narrative settled into a meditation on autonomy, the resilience of self-respect, and the profound yet understated power of choosing personal freedom over reaction, resentment, or revenge. In the end, Ethan understood what the betrayal had ultimately taught him, that true strength lay not in control over others, but in command over oneself. And as Manhattan's lights shimmered beneath him, vast and unjudging, he stepped forward into the quiet expanse of possibility, carrying clarity, dignity, and the subtle triumph of a life reclaimed.